Welcome, fellow explorers of history. Imagine for a moment. The year is 1600, a year that will forever shape the fate of a nation. Japan, a land scarred by decades of bloodshed, stands on the cusp of a new chapter. For centuries, the country has been divided by warlords, each vying for control, each seeking to claim power over a fragmented empire. But now, after endless conflict, there's a chance for something new, a possibility for peace and unity. But peace, as always, comes with its price. And that price is Sekigahara. The battle that will unfold on the field of Sekigahara isn't just a fight for territory, it's a fight for the soul of Japan. On one side, we have Ieyasu Tokugawa, a man whose ambition and cunning have led him from humble beginnings to become a force that cannot be ignored. With his Eastern army, Ieyasu promises peace, a unified Japan under his rule, an end to the chaos that has plagued the land for so long. But peace can come at a cost, one that may leave those loyal to the old ways wondering if it's worth the price. On the other side stands Ishida Mitsunari, the commander of the Western Army, a man fiercely loyal to the Toyotomi clan and to Hideyoshi's vision for Japan's future. The Toyotomi legacy, once a beacon of hope for a united Japan, now teeters on the brink of collapse. Mitsunari is not just fighting for power, he's fighting to preserve the dream of unity, the promise of a future under the Toyotomi banner. But what happens when the two visions for Japan's future collide? What happens when loyalty, which has been the bedrock of the samurai code for centuries, is tested by the overwhelming tide of history and change? This, my friends, is where our story begins, not with two armies marching toward battle, but with one samurai, a man caught between the old world and the new, between loyalty to his lord and the emerging reality of Ieyasu's power. His name is Takeshi, and like so many others caught in the crossfire of Sekigahara, his loyalty to his lord will be tested in ways he could never have imagined. Takeshi is a man of honor, a samurai raised to believe that loyalty to his lord is the very essence of what it means to be a warrior. But loyalty, as he's about to learn, is never as simple as it seems. Imagine the weight of such a decision, the choice between loyalty to the Toyotomi family, the family who raised him, who trusted him with their lives, and the promise of peace and stability under Ieyasu Tokugawa. Imagine being faced with a battle where the outcome will reshape Japan forever, and knowing that the decision you make, the side you fight for, will not only determine your fate, but will ripple through the generations to come. How do you choose between the past and the future when both sides demand everything from you? In the midst of this uncertainty, Takeshi must wrestle with his loyalty. But he's not just fighting for himself. He's fighting for the future of his family, his village, and the legacy of the samurai. What does it mean to be a warrior when your heart is torn between two competing visions? What does it mean to stand by your lord's side when you begin to fear that their path may lead to ruin? The loyalty that samurai are raised to uphold has always been simple until now. But what happens when loyalty to a man becomes loyalty to a system, and that system is no longer the one you believed in? Takeshi is about to find out that honor can be both a blessing and a curse. Before we continue this journey into the heart of Sekigahara, where the lives of thousands will be decided, I want to take a moment. If you're moved by stories of duty, honor, and personal sacrifice, go ahead and hit that like button. If you're new to the channel, Make sure you subscribe to join us on more epic historical journeys. And if you've got friends who love stories about loyalty, betrayal, and fate, be sure to share this video with them. Trust me, this is a story you won't want to miss. Because it's not just about the battle, it's about the choices that define a man's soul. So, what happens when loyalty is no longer enough? What happens when honor is tested by a future so uncertain, so unpredictable, that even the mightiest samurai cannot see the end? Let's step into the world of Takeshi, a samurai caught between two great lords, and follow his journey as he is forced to make a choice that will change the course of his life and possibly Japan's destiny. The morning sky hung heavy with a muted gray, a blanket of clouds that seemed to reflect the uncertainty and weight of the days to come. The air, thick with the scent of the earth and the sea from the distant shores of Sekigahara, whispered of the coming storm. Takeshi stood on the precipice of the battlefield, staring out into the horizon, his katana hanging loosely at his side. His gaze was far off, but his thoughts were a whirlwind, caught between the past, the present, and the future. In the distance, the preparations for war were underway. The Eastern Army, led by Ieyasu Tokugawa, amassed with its immense forces, preparing to march against the Western Army, his army, led by Ishida Mitsunari, a man of fiery determination and unwavering loyalty to the Toyotomi clan. The ground, already soaked by the anticipation of battle, was still, almost eerily calm. But beneath the stillness, an undercurrent of tension ran through the camp, reflected in the faces of his comrades. They, like him, were caught between the loyalty to their lord and the shifting tides of history, torn by the harsh reality that change was inevitable, whether they wanted it or not. Takeshi, the voice of his closest comrade, Ichiro, broke through his reverie. Ichiro's face was set in determination, but there was a trace of doubt in his eyes. It was the same look Takeshi had seen in the eyes of so many samurai recently, a look that betrayed a deep uncertainty. We fought for Mitsunari and the Toyotomi clan, but do you ever wonder if we're standing in the right place? Takeshi didn't respond at first. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. The silence between them was almost tangible, as if the very weight of history pressed down on them both. "I don't know, Ichiro," Takeshi said finally, his voice a mixture of frustration and sadness. "We are loyal, but the world is changing, and our loyalty doesn't seem to matter as much as it did before." Ichiro stepped closer, his eyes sharp as he looked at Takeshi. "And what do you want, Takeshi? You think we should simply throw away our honor, our loyalty to Mitsunari and the Toyotomi clan, just because the winds of fate have shifted? The people of Japan are counting on us. They are looking to us to hold the line, to keep the Toyotomi legacy alive." Takeshi's heart tightened at the words. "It's not about loyalty, Ichiro. It's about survival." He gazed out at the approaching army in the distance, his eyes narrowing. "I see the might of Ieyasu Tokugawa, the man who has crushed everything in his path. His forces grow, and his power cannot be ignored anymore. How long can we keep fighting a battle we know we cannot win?" Ichiro clenched his fists, his face hardening. "You speak as though we've already lost, but we haven't. We're still standing. Mitsunari believes in the Toyotomi cause, and so do I. We fight for more than just power. We fight for the soul of Japan. Don't forget, Takeshi, why we're here. It's about justice, about honor, about preserving something that is worth fighting for. Takeshi's mind reeled, just as he had always believed in it, but as he gazed upon the amassed army of Ieyasu, that belief seemed distant, almost naive. Ieyasu's ambition was relentless, and his forces were unstoppable. Each day that passed seemed to bring them closer to the end of the Toyotomi clan's reign. His father's voice echoed in his mind. A samurai's duty is to his lord, but loyalty to one's country and to the future must never be overlooked. Takeshi's hand tightened around the hilt of his katana. The weight of it felt heavier now, as if it carried not only the responsibility of a warrior, but the very weight of his family's honor, his father's legacy, and his future. His father had always taught him that loyalty was more than just an oath. It was a bond that shaped who you were as a person, as a samurai. But was it still worth it, knowing that Mitsunari's cause was slowly falling apart? As the day wore on, Takeshi walked alone through the camp, his thoughts distant. He passed groups of samurai, preparing their armor, sharpening their blades, and gathering supplies for what was sure to be a fierce battle. Their faces were set, determined, but Takeshi could see the cracks forming. Fear and doubt lingered in the air, unspoken but palpable. He couldn't ignore the unease that had settled in his chest. He had sworn his sword to Mitsunari, and by extension, to Toyotomi Hideyori, the son of Hideyoshi, the man who had once united Japan. Yet now, as the Tokugawa forces grew stronger, and the Western army prepared for battle, Takeshi questioned if loyalty was the right path, or if it was leading them to their doom. That night, as the camp settled into uneasy rest, Takeshi found himself alone by the campfire. The quiet crackle of the flames was the only sound that filled the emptiness around him. He took a deep breath, looking at the reflection of the fire in his sword. His thoughts drifted to the people of Sekigahara, his family, and to the future. What was it all for? He muttered to himself, almost in a prayer. Honor is a shield. But what if that shield is forged in the fires of uncertainty? A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. It was Ichiro, who had come to find him. The battle is close, my friend, Ichiro said quietly, sitting beside him. Tomorrow, we will face the dawn, and the fate of Japan will be decided. I know your heart is heavy, Takeshi. I feel it too. Takeshi nodded but didn't speak. Ichiro, he whispered, is this battle worth it? What if we lose? What if all of this has been for nothing? Ichiro placed a hand on his shoulder. Loyalty is about more than the battle itself, Takeshi. It's about standing for what we believe in, even when the world falls apart. Even if we fall, our cause, our faith will live on. That's the price we pay for being samurai. It's the price we pay for honor. Takeshi turned to Ichiro, the weight of his words settling into his chest. And if we lose? Ichiro met his gaze. Then we die as men of honor, fighting for what's right. This fight is our legacy, Takeshi, and I can't think of a better way to live and die than for the future of this country. Takeshi stood, his resolve beginning to solidify. There was no turning back now. The future was uncertain, but his honor would carry him through, whatever the cost. Tomorrow we fight, Takeshi whispered to himself. Not for ourselves, but for something greater than us. And with that thought, Takeshi made his vow. He would stand firm, no matter the outcome, for his lord, his people, and the future of Japan. Internal conflict. The battle would soon begin, but it wasn't just a battle of armies. Takeshi's soul had already been torn in two. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like an invisible force, relentless and unforgiving. Every moment felt like it was pulling him deeper into a void, and the ground beneath him seemed to shift, becoming more unstable with every passing second. He could feel the tension in his bones, the invisible tug of war between honor, loyalty, and survival. He stood motionless for a moment, taking in the chaotic preparations for war around him. But his thoughts were a storm, a whirlwind of confusion and doubt. The horizon seemed to blur, the line between reality and his internal conflict dissolving. Was it his loyalty that had brought him this far? Or was it something deeper, something about identity, about who he had always believed himself to be? He could hear his father's voice again, so clear in his mind as if the old warrior were standing right beside him. The teachings of a man who had spent his life under Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a man who had served without question and believed that the samurai's soul was bound to their lord. A samurai's life is not his own. It is his lord's, and to his lord he owes everything. If that loyalty is lost, so is the samurai's soul. The words were like an unbreakable chain, a bond that had kept him anchored throughout his training, his service, his rise as a samurai. But now, as the drums of war thundered from the distance, those words seemed hollow. How could one's soul be so tied to another's fate? Was it not the samurai's duty to protect the people, to serve something greater than themselves? Takeshi clenched his fists around the hilt of his sword, feeling the familiar weight of it in his palm, grounding him. Yet that weight seemed heavier now, like the blade was no longer an instrument of honor, but a reminder of the price he was about to pay. He thought back to the years of peace, before the war, when his life had been simple. A farm boy turned samurai, raised in the village, living a life of routine and quiet contentment. There had been family meals, laughter, and shared work under the sun, all centered around a sense of community, a community that had been built on mutual respect, faith, and a shared bond. But that world had shattered with the rise of war, and now it was no longer a matter of survival. It was a matter of choosing which side would decide the future. His heart ached as he thought of his mother, the quiet woman who had always told him to be a man of peace, not just a warrior. She had always believed that family came first, that their faith was their shield against the world. But this war, the one that was coming, wasn't about family anymore. This was about fate. The future of Japan was hanging in the balance, and Ieyasu Tokugawa's army, with its disciplined strategy, might very well bring the peace that the Toyotomi clan could no longer secure. Was it worth dying for a dream that no longer seemed possible? Could his sword still serve the purpose he had been raised to uphold? As the hours passed and the preparations for battle grew louder, Takeshi's resolve weakened, like a bamboo branch swaying under the weight of a storm. He had always prided himself on his loyalty to his father, to his lord, and to his country. But now, the lines between these allegiances seemed blurred, tangled in a web of doubt. In the quiet of the night, he found himself walking alone beneath the pale light of the moon, away from the chaos of camp, seeking a moment of solitude. The air was crisp, the night still, as though even the world itself was holding its breath before the inevitable clash. He looked up at the moon, pale and distant, and the whispers of his past came flooding back. His father had died young, a warrior who had served under Hideyoshi, sacrificing everything for the Toyotomi cause. Takeshi had inherited that devotion, but now, in this cold silence, that loyalty felt like an iron shackle, heavy and confining. "What if there is no glory in this?" Takeshi whispered to the night. "What if loyalty to Mitsunari and the Toyotomi clan is just a fool's game, a losing battle that will only lead to more suffering?" He sat down beside the ancient oak tree that had stood for decades, its roots deep in the earth, a symbol of stability and tradition. The wind whispered through its branches, and for a moment Takeshi closed his eyes, listening to the rustling leaves. What if my father was wrong? The thought was like a cold chill seeping into his bones. What if loyalty is not enough? What if survival means aligning with Ieyasu, even if it means betraying everything I've ever known? He could hear the faint sounds of laughter from the camp in the distance, his comrades, preparing for war, finding moments of humor in the face of inevitable death. His friends, his brothers in arms, were all bound by the same oath: to fight for Mitsunari, to fight for Toyotomi Hideyori, and the legacy of Hideyoshi. But they were also afraid, and Takeshi could see it in their eyes, the fear of failure, the fear of being crushed by Ieyasu's rising tide. He thought of his sister, Aiko, and the quiet prayers they had said together in their youth. "We fought for the Toyotomi dream," he whispered softly to the night. "But was it ever truly our dream, or just a dream we inherited?" "It's not too late," Takeshi muttered, standing up. "The sword has always been my life, my calling, but I must choose how to wield it." He looked up at the horizon once more, a mix of determination and fear sweeping over him. The battle was coming. There was no turning back. The decision had already been made in his heart, but whether it was the right one, he could not yet see. What was loyalty worth in this fight for survival? In the stillness of the night, Takeshi made his vow: "I will fight for what is right, for the future of my country, for my family." His hand rested on his katana, feeling the cool steel beneath his fingertips. "Even if it costs me my soul." Tomorrow, the battle would begin, and with it, his fate would be sealed. Poetry and reflection. That night, as the camp fell into a heavy silence, Takeshi found himself alone by the campfire, the embers flickering weakly in the cool night air. The wind whispered through the trees, a soft rustling sound that barely cut through the oppressive stillness. The smell of smoke lingered in the air, and the darkness pressed in on all sides, a heavy shroud that made the camp feel distant from the rest of the world. The quiet of the night only intensified the unrest gnawing at him, an unrest born from the conflict that now raged within his heart. Takeshi sat down on a weathered log near the fire, his katana resting against his leg. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small folded piece of paper, the last written words from his father. His fingers traced the faded ink, the characters smooth to the touch, yet heavy with meaning. His father had written these words for him long ago, just before sending him off to war. "When the sword is raised, the heart trembles. The samurai stands alone in the storm. The past and future collide in blood, and loyalty becomes the only way to survive." Takeshi read the words aloud to the night air, the familiar weight of the poem settling heavily on his chest. He felt the words reverberate in his bones, each line like a beating drum that brought with it both strength and sorrow. Loyalty, his father had taught him, was the core of a samurai's existence. Without it, he was no more than a warrior without a master, a man without honor. But now, as the Battle of Sekigahara loomed ever closer, Takeshi's loyalty was no longer so clear-cut. He let the words sink in as the fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows across his face. "What if the sword is not enough?" he whispered to the night, unsure if he was seeking an answer or simply lost in the depths of his own thoughts. His mind wandered, torn between honor and doubt. His father's voice echoed back in his mind, a voice so vivid that it felt as though his father were standing right next to him. "Loyalty is a shield, Takeshi. But what if it is forged in the fires of uncertainty?" The words had always made sense to him when he was younger. Loyalty to his lord was the very foundation of his life. Mitsunari had been his lord, the one he had sworn to protect. But now, as the Tokugawa forces closed in on them, as Ieyasu Tokugawa's power grew stronger by the day, Takeshi wondered if his loyalty to the Toyotomi clan was still enough. Could loyalty to a man still guide him when the world around him was changing so fast? Conversations with Mitsunari. The following morning, as the sun rose weakly over the battlefield, Takeshi stood before Ishida Mitsunari, the head of the Western Army, his lord, and the man he had sworn his life to. Mitsunari's face was grim as he surveyed the growing forces, his eyes sharp with determination, but the tension in his jaw betrayed the weight of the decisions that lay ahead. "Takeshi," Mitsunari said, his voice cutting through the silence. "You've fought for me since the beginning. You've proven your loyalty. But now, the future of our family is on the line. The Toyotomi bloodline, the legacy of Hideyoshi, it all rests on this battle. Do you stand with me now, even when the world is changing, even when the outcome seems uncertain?" Takeshi felt his heart tighten at the question. Mitsunari's eyes were full of fire, the passion of a man who had devoted his life to the Toyotomi cause. But Takeshi had seen the rumors, the infiltrations, the shifting of allegiance, the growing power of Ieyasu, and the unrelenting march of Tokugawa's army. "I stand with you, my lord. I have always stood by the Toyotomi cause," Takeshi said, his voice quieter than he intended, a nagging doubt festering beneath the words. They sounded hollow in his ears, as though they didn't hold the same weight they once had. He couldn't shake the feeling that Ieyasu was a force beyond their control. Mitsunari's gaze softened slightly, but his conviction didn't waver. "Then you will fight for what we believe in. This is not just about us. This is about the future of our land. We will unite it under the Toyotomi banner. Takeshi, we must. For Japan." Takeshi nodded, but the weight of Mitsunari's words felt like an anchor in his chest. Mitsunari believed in them, in their cause. But Takeshi had seen the reality of Ieyasu's growing strength. He wanted to believe in Mitsunari's vision, but Takeshi's reflection. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Takeshi found himself alone, once again standing on the edge of the camp, staring out at the distant mountains. The air had grown cooler, and the camp was still buzzing with the sounds of warriors preparing for battle. But Takeshi felt a deep silence settle over him, the stillness of the night amplifying his thoughts. His father's teachings echoed again in his mind, louder now, as if the very weight of his legacy were demanding his attention. A samurai's life is not his own. It is his lord's, and to his lord he owes everything. But did that still ring true? Was loyalty to Mitsunari truly worth dying for? Or had the very notion of honor become a shackling force, holding him back from seeing the bigger picture. Takeshi's eyes wandered to the small bundle of belongings beside him, a symbol of the life he had built with the Toyotomi clan, a life he had always sworn to protect. The sword beside him, the one his father had passed down to him, was a symbol of his loyalty, of his duty. But that sword, once a tool of protection, now felt more like a reminder of the price he was about to pay. He reached for it, fingers brushing the smooth hilt, and whispered into the night, "I will fight, not because I have to, but because I believe in what is worth fighting for." The words felt heavy in his chest, but they were true. His loyalty was not simply to Mitsunari. It was to the future, to the peace that might rise from the ashes of war. But the cost, he couldn't ignore it. Every warrior in the Western Army would pay the price, and Takeshi wondered how many would fall. Would his death even matter? Would it change anything in the end? "I will stand for my lord," Takeshi whispered, his voice determined. "I will stand for my family, for my people, and if I fall, I will fall with honor, knowing that I gave everything for what I believed in." The promise to himself was all he had left. Tomorrow, the battle would begin. Tomorrow, the world would change. His fate would be sealed, and the fate of Japan would lie in the hands of those who fought for it. Takeshi had made his choice. There was no turning back now. He had sworn his sword to his lord, and though the world was shifting and the future uncertain, he would fight until the end. Whether he lived or died, he would die honorably, a samurai true to his oath. The days grew longer, and the quiet anticipation before the storm began to pulse like the heartbeat of a dying animal. The fields of Sekigahara stretched wide before him, empty yet brimming with the weight of a future soon to be determined. Every step on the soil seemed to sink deeper into the earth's sorrow, as though the land itself felt the impending doom. Takeshi stood, eyes fixed on the horizon, the distant thrum of the advancing armies barely audible in the stillness. The Eastern Army, led by the brilliant and calculating Ieyasu Tokugawa, was a force like no other. The discipline, the sheer numbers, the unstoppable tide, all of it was evident in the preparations. They were not merely soldiers, they were conquerors, and their presence seemed to swallow the land whole. On the opposite side stood the Western Army, led by the loyal but increasingly isolated Ishida Mitsunari, fighting to preserve the Toyotomi legacy. Takeshi's eyes flickered briefly to his fellow comrades in the Western camp, each one weighed down by the same heavy burden. Their resolve was there, but it seemed fragile, like an ancient fortress crumbling under the weight of time. Takeshi could feel it in the air, the nervous energy that spread through the camp like a silent contagion. It wasn't the anxiety of a man preparing for battle, it was the unease of a soul caught in the winds of change, uncertain whether to fight or let go. His fingers tightened around the hilt of his katana, the cold steel reminding him of his duty, but the more he held it, the more the weight of it seemed to grow, like the sword itself was pulling him toward some unknowable fate. "It's all coming to an end," Takeshi muttered to himself, barely louder than a whisper, though he knew the words would carry farther than he intended. He had always been a man of action, the sword his tool, his loyalty his bond. But the loyalty that had once been clear, unyielding, was now muddled by the growing power of Ieyasu's forces. The very nature of their struggle felt different this time. The stakes were higher. Victory was no longer guaranteed by mere strength or honor. The world was shifting, and the old codes seemed to offer no clear answers. The Toyotomi clan, his lord's family, had always been the symbol of resistance, of unity, but the hope they once embodied was fading, like light disappearing behind dark clouds. Mitsunari's rallying cries still rang in the air, but even his passion seemed more like a ghost of what it had once been. Every soldier who heard it echoed the same familiar refrain. For the Toyotomi, for the future of Japan. But even Takeshi felt the doubt hanging between the words, like an unspoken secret that no one dared to address. What if it's too late? Takeshi thought. The future of Japan was slipping through his fingers, and his loyalty was no longer a clear line in the sand. Mitsunari, for all his conviction, was losing ground. Ieyasu's rise was unavoidable, and with every hour that passed, it became harder to deny that the future might belong to the Tokugawa clan. As night fell, the camp grew quiet. The sounds of armies preparing for war faded into a low hum, the same rhythm of anticipation that vibrated through Takeshi's chest. He stood at the edge of the camp, the firelight casting long shadows, making him feel as if he were standing on the edge of history itself. The world felt both immense and small, and for the first time, Takeshi couldn't decide where his place in it was. The battle would soon begin. But it wasn't just a battle of armies. Takeshi's soul had already been torn in two. He could feel his father's voice again, echoing from his childhood, its steady reassurance, its pride, the legacy of a man who had served under Hideyoshi without question. His father had always said, "A samurai's life is not his own. It is his lord's, and to his lord he owes everything. If that loyalty is lost, so is the samurai's soul." End of tip. The words had been so simple to him as a child, comforting in their certainty, like the guiding light of a lantern on a dark path. But now, in the face of this overwhelming war, those words felt empty, like an anchor in the middle of a storm, dragging him deeper into confusion. Is loyalty truly all there is? Was a man's honor so entrenched in the service of his lord that it could blind him to the changing world around him? Takeshi closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the heavy weight of the sword still at his side. His katana, his companion, had always represented his loyalty. But now, its meaning seemed to change, becoming something more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of his choice, of the path he was walking. The blade had once been an extension of his honor, but now, as the weight of the battle grew heavier, it felt like a reminder of his growing uncertainty. As the night wore on, the camp grew quieter, save for the murmurs of warriors finishing their final preparations. Takeshi's eyes wandered over the horizon once again, where the Eastern Army loomed in the distance, the glint of armor barely visible under the dimming light. Ieyasu's forces were immense, and their approach seemed like an unstoppable wave. "Will loyalty be enough?" Takeshi whispered to the wind, wondering if his sword would ever be enough to defend the honor he had so long protected. But as the hours passed, something began to stir in him, a feeling he couldn't ignore. The winds of change were more than just the storm on the horizon. They were inside him. Takeshi had always believed in honor and duty, but now, those concepts felt like the same chains that had once bound him. The battle for Japan's soul was no longer about loyalty to a lord. It was about loyalty to something greater, something more profound than the struggles of the present. What if this war was not mine to fight? Takeshi thought. What if the future of Japan lies beyond the bloodshed, beyond this battle? He turned away from the distant battlefield, his heart heavy with the realization that the path ahead was unclear. The night had settled in completely now, the darkness wrapping around him like a thick blanket. He was no longer sure of his place in this war, nor what the right decision would be. The loyalty to Mitsunari, the loyalty to Toyotomi, had been his foundation for so long. But now, as the war neared, that foundation was crumbling beneath him. Tomorrow, the battle would begin, and with it, his choice would be made. Would he stand with his lord, despite all the changes, despite the rising power of Ieyasu? Or would he abandon the past and place his sword in service of a new future? The winds of change had come, and with them, Takeshi's future was slipping from his grasp. He would have to choose, and whatever path he took, it would be a path that shaped not only his destiny, but the very soul of Japan itself. Rising tensions. Takeshi had always been a man of loyalty, raised with a deep respect for the samurai code. His father, a warrior of great integrity, had drilled those values into him from an early age. Loyalty to one's lord, honor in battle, and service to the people had been the foundations of his life. He had always prided himself on being a man of his word, a samurai whose soul was bound to his lord and his family's legacy. But now, as the days passed in the shadow of Sekigahara, that loyalty had become a burden, a weight that hung on his heart, clouding his thoughts and making each step heavier than the last. The air in the camp felt thick with unease, the whispers of fellow samurai buzzing through the ranks like a gathering storm. In the distance, Ieyasu Tokugawa's army grew in number and strength, their forces swelling like the tide of an inevitable flood. The stories of his victories had reached every corner of Japan, passed on by the mouths of soldiers, traders, and travelers. Ieyasu was becoming a legend, his victories marked by efficiency, his strategic genius lauded by those who followed him, and feared by those who stood in his way. His rise was like a slow, steady earthquake, cracking open the land, leaving nothing untouched by his ambition. The camp, once full of hope, was now suffused with doubt. There were whispers everywhere now. It was as if the wind itself carried rumors, spreading them from one corner of the camp to the other. "Ieyasu is unstoppable," one of his comrades said, his voice low and heavy as he sharpened his katana. The blade caught the light of the nearby campfire, its edge gleaming like a promise of a new world. "He's already united the East. With every victory, his grip on the land tightens. The West cannot stand against him for long." Takeshi couldn't help but listen. Every word seemed to stick in his chest, the truth of them sinking into his mind like the weight of a stone sinking into water. The fear in his heart had been growing for some time now, and now it was becoming more than just an emotional weight. It was becoming real. Another voice echoed the sentiment as another samurai approached, casting a glance at Ieyasu's banners fluttering in the distance. "Mitsunari is a good man," the samurai said, lowering his voice to a whisper, as if afraid someone would hear. "But his vision is fading. Ieyasu's ambition is too powerful to ignore. It's only a matter of time before the Toyotomi cause crumbles. We may have the numbers, but he has the strength." Takeshi's hand tightened around the hilt of his katana, feeling its familiar weight, but the reassurance it had always given him now felt distant. His mind churned with the implications of these words, each one a crack in the foundation of his loyalty. Mitsunari, his lord, had always stood for what Takeshi believed in. But now, he couldn't escape the nagging thought that perhaps Mitsunari's cause was not as strong as they had once believed. Perhaps the Toyotomi cause was already lost, bleeding out beneath the weight of the Tokugawa's overwhelming might. He stood alone at the edge of the camp that evening, the darkening skies above him reflecting the growing storm inside. The land before him stretched wide and open, the distant mountains just visible beneath the thickening clouds. He could feel the tension in the air, the quiet before the battle that would decide the fate of his country. The rising tide of Ieyasu's army was now impossible to ignore. Every day that passed, the Tokugawa forces came closer, a looming wall of power, as steady as the passage of time itself. Ieyasu's presence could be felt in every corner of Japan. His army seemed to grow with every victory. The whispers of the camp now carried the same message. Ieyasu was inevitable. The familiar feeling of loyalty that had always been his guiding star was now waning, stretched thin by the reality of the world around him. Takeshi had never been a man of doubt, but now, as he looked over the camp, over the faces of his comrades preparing for a battle they knew they might not win, he couldn't shake the feeling that the world was slipping away from him, like sand through his fingers. As he stood at the edge of the camp, staring out over the field that would soon be filled with the crash of armies and the echoes of war, Takeshi's thoughts turned inward. The wind tugged at the edges of his armor, pulling at the very fabric of his resolve. The cold night air seemed to mirror his emotions, chilled, uncertain, fragile. He had always believed that loyalty was a simple truth, a bond that could not be broken. But now, as the looming shadow of Ieyasu's Tokugawa army closed in on them, Takeshi felt that loyalty was not enough. What is loyalty to a lost cause? What is loyalty when the world itself is changing, when history is unfolding, and his path forward is unclear? His fingers brushed against the hilt of his sword again, the weight of it grounding him in the present. But even that felt different, heavier, as though the very steel of his katana carried the burden of the past and the future. Is loyalty enough? He whispered to the night, a question he had never allowed himself to ask before. The words were strange to him, like a crack in the armor, but they felt like the truth. What if it's not enough? What if the future belongs to Ieyasu? The moon began to rise, casting its pale light over the camp and the world beyond. Ieyasu, the man who had once been a distant figure, a rival, a force to be reckoned with, now felt like a looming specter. Takeshi's sword had once been a symbol of loyalty, of honor, of his commitment to Mitsunari. But now, it felt like a tool in a battle he was no longer sure he believed in. The loyalty that had been his foundation now seemed like a shackle, weighing him down, pulling him toward a decision he didn't want to make. What if his father was wrong? What if blind loyalty was no longer the path to honor, but the road to ruin? Takeshi clenched his fist around the hilt, the grip tight, the metal cold against his skin. He had always trusted in the samurai code, had always believed that loyalty to his lord was the highest virtue. But now, standing on the edge of war, he began to wonder if that loyalty was sacrificing his own soul, if it was keeping him from seeing the future that was already unfolding before him. The questions gnawed at him. The future seemed uncertain, the very fabric of his world unraveling. And for the first time in his life, Takeshi felt that the answer he sought might not lie in the honor of the samurai code, but in something greater, something that transcended even his oath to Mitsunari. The camp was quiet around him, but the silence felt louder than the drums of war. And as he stood there, the weight of loyalty, duty, and honor began to feel intolerable. The conflict of allegiance. That night, Takeshi could not sleep. His mind raced, running over the stories he had heard, the growing murmurs from his fellow samurai, the unmistakable scent of defeat in the air. He couldn't escape the questions that plagued him. Is Mitsunari's vision still worth fighting for? Is Ieyasu the inevitable future? His thoughts turned to Mitsunari, the man he had sworn loyalty to. Mitsunari had always been a man of principle and passion, fiercely committed to the Toyotomi legacy. But recently, Takeshi had begun to feel a distance between the leader he once revered and the man who now stood before him, stubborn, proud, and unwilling to yield to the realities of a changing world. Was Mitsunari still the right leader for Japan's future? Or had he become too entrenched in the past, too obsessed with preserving the Toyotomi cause at all costs? Takeshi had seen the doubt in the eyes of other samurai, his fellow soldiers, as they whispered in hushed voices. Could they truly win against the might of Ieyasu's forces? The Western army was dwindling, and the Eastern army was unstoppable, crushing all in its path. Takeshi thought back to the days before the battle, when Mitsunari had spoken of the Toyotomi's vision for Japan, and how Takeshi had believed in that vision with all his heart. But the words didn't carry the same weight anymore. This is not just a battle for us, Mitsunari had said, his voice filled with fire. This is for the future of Japan. If we fall, Japan falls with us. But what did that mean now? Would Mitsunari's dream collapse, just like the world around them? Takeshi's mind wandered back to his family, to his sister Aiko, and the days of peace they had once shared. Those days felt like a lifetime ago. He could still remember the quiet evenings when they sat together at the dinner table, the scent of rice and fish filling the air, his mother's voice steady, as she spoke of faith, of family, and of honor. Would she understand the choices he was being forced to make now? He looked down at his hands, the very hands that had once tilled the soil, that had once held a child's toy and played in the field. Now, they gripped a sword, ready to spill blood in the name of loyalty. But for what? Father, Takeshi whispered into the night, his voice trembling. What would you say now? I am standing on the edge, unsure of where to turn. His father's teachings had been the foundation of his life, but now they seemed inadequate in the face of the complex reality he faced. His father had always said, "Loyalty is your shield. Without it, you have no soul." But was that still true when the enemy was not just an army, but a new order rising? One that promised peace, but at what cost? Could Ieyasu's Japan be a place of peace? Or was it simply another version of the same old tyranny? Decision-making. As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of deep orange and crimson, Takeshi stood in the center of the camp. His body was weary from a night spent wrestling with his own soul. But the weight of the sword in his hand felt heavier than ever before. I can't remain neutral, he whispered to himself, feeling the finality of his words settle in his chest. The time has come. Taro, his oldest friend and comrade in arms, approached him, his face solemn as he regarded Takeshi. Takeshi, you've been distant these past few days. Your mind seems far away from here. Where is your heart? Takeshi's gaze met Taro's, his eyes filled with both pain and resolve. I am torn, Taro. I am torn between duty and reality." Taro's expression softened as he stepped closer, placing a hand on Takeshi's shoulder. "We all are. But loyalty is not a weakness. It's the strength that holds us together." But Takeshi's mind remained clouded. "What happens when your loyalty no longer holds you together?" he asked softly, as if speaking to the wind. "What happens when standing for the past means abandoning the future?" Taro stared at him for a long moment before speaking again. "Then we have to trust that what we fight for is worth the cost. Whatever happens on the battlefield, we stand by what is right, whether or not we live to see it." Takeshi took a deep breath, his fingers tightening on the sword. "I will not run. I will not abandon Mitsunari, but I am no longer sure if I fight for the future or for the past." That night, as Takeshi lay awake under the dim moonlight, his thoughts swirled around him like the wind. "I will stand by my lord," he vowed. But in the pit of his stomach, he couldn't shake the feeling that the battle wasn't just about loyalty, it was about the soul of Japan. Could the future be shaped by their swords? Or was something more needed, something beyond the honor of the past? The days preceding the battle were clouded with anticipation, the air thick with an unspoken tension. The massive armies of both Ieyasu Tokugawa and Ishida Mitsunari were gathering for the climactic showdown at Sekigahara. But the ground seemed still, almost too quiet. Soldiers moved about with purpose, yet the underlying sense of uncertainty hung like a dense fog that clouded both their minds and their spirits. Takeshi stood near the edge of the camp, his katana resting lightly at his side, his thoughts weighing heavier than any blade. He had always thought of himself as a man of honor, driven by loyalty and duty. His life, up until now, had been a string of commitments to his lord, to Mitsunari, and to the Toyotomi cause. Yet, as the camp swelled with activity, preparing for the great battle, his mind could no longer ignore the reality of their situation. The Western Army, though valiant, felt like a ragged, fading force, one that lacked the unity and momentum of Ieyasu Tokugawa's growing empire. Takeshi had seen the whispers among the men, heard the quiet doubts creeping into conversations. "Ieyasu's forces are unstoppable," one soldier had muttered as he cleaned his armor, his tone almost regretful. "We've been fighting for months, and now it feels like we're just waiting to be swallowed whole by them." Another samurai, his face drawn with fatigue, sighed as he spoke. "Mitsunari's passion is strong, but Ieyasu's power, it's inevitable. Our cause, it feels like it's slipping through our fingers." These were the kinds of comments that haunted Takeshi as he prepared for the battle ahead. His loyalty to Mitsunari had always been unwavering, but now, in the quiet of his own mind, doubt began to worm its way through his resolve. What if this battle was not the end of the Toyotomi clan's suffering? What if their cause was already lost? The Western Army had gathered in full force thousands of men, each one prepared to die for the Toyotomi family. Yet the reality was sinking in that they were fighting against an empire that had already won the East. Ieyasu's strategic genius, his ability to command and inspire loyalty, had outmatched Mitsunari's more impassioned but less organized leadership. Ieyasu was a force of nature, and every victory he won seemed to erase a bit more of Mitsunari's claim to the future of Japan. Internal conversations with Mitsunari. The day before the battle, Takeshi stood among his fellow warriors as Mitsunari addressed the men. His words were full of fury pride and passion, the same words he had used countless times before. We fight not just for ourselves, but for our legacy. Mitsunari's voice rang out, cutting through the hushed murmur of the crowd. The Toyotomi cause is not just about power, it is about the soul of this land. If we let Ieyasu's ambition go unchecked, it will consume us all. We must protect our country, our honor, our future. We are the last line of defense against a new tyranny that would see us all bow to his will. This battle is not just ours, it is for Japan itself. Takeshi stood in the crowd, his hands gripping the hilt of his katana tightly. He had heard these words before, and they had always inspired him, filled him with a sense of pride and purpose. But this time, as he looked around at his fellow samurai, he saw something in their faces that worried him. Doubt. The same doubt he had been feeling in the pit of his stomach. The fire in Mitsunari's eyes was undeniable, but Takeshi couldn't ignore the reality that the Western army was now a broken force, united only by a fading sense of duty. We will stand firm, Mitsunari continued, his voice thick with emotion. The Toyotomi cause is not just about defending our lord. It's about defying the odds, about standing up against the forces that would see Japan fall into a future without honor. This battle will be remembered for centuries. It will be our legacy. Takeshi could feel the weight of Mitsunari's words, the conviction in every syllable. But there was something else, something beneath it all, that gnawed at him. Honor and duty were no longer enough. He couldn't ignore the growing strength of Ieyasu Tokugawa any longer. Could Mitsunari's vision be enough to save Japan? Was it possible for the Toyotomi clan to stand against Ieyasu's empire? Takeshi's hands tightened on the sword as he turned away from the speech. He couldn't shake the feeling that this battle, the one they were about to face, wasn't just about victory or defeat. It was about something more profound. It was about the soul of Japan, and whether that soul would be shackled under Ieyasu's rule or preserved under the Toyotomi's banner. The choice that lay ahead felt too great for a man to bear. But it was a choice that would decide everything. Personal reflection. As the night drew on, the camp grew quieter, and the weight of Takeshi's thoughts grew heavier still. What if Mitsunari's dream was already doomed? Could a man's loyalty and passion alone sustain the fight against such overwhelming odds? Takeshi walked away from the campfire, looking out at the shadowed landscape where the Eastern Army would soon march. The moon hung low in the sky, casting its pale light over the land, and the cool breeze of the coming night swept through the camp, carrying with it the weight of the coming battle. Takeshi thought back to the day he had been recruited into the Toyotomi cause, the proud moment when his father had given him the sword and told him to fight for something greater than himself. But as the battle drew nearer, the sword now felt more like a chain, a symbol of a duty that was becoming unbearably heavy. His father had been loyal to Hideyoshi, and so was he. But was the Toyotomi cause still worth fighting for? Takeshi stopped and looked down at the ground beneath him. The earth was cracked, worn from years of war, and the footsteps of the soldiers echoed like ghosts in the night. He thought of his father's voice again, ringing in his ears. A samurai must protect his lord, even if it means sacrificing his own life. That is the way of the sword. But was that still true? How many more will fall in this fight? Takeshi whispered to himself, his voice shaking slightly. And will it even matter in the end? The more he thought about it, the less he could deny it. Ieyasu's power was undeniable. The Eastern Army's forces were unmatched, their strategy a perfect blend of strength and discipline. His dreams of peace and unity would sweep across Japan, whether the Toyotomi clan survived or not. I can't ignore the reality of this war, Takeshi muttered under his breath, the weight of his decision now firmly setting into his chest. But my loyalty to Mitsunari, it's all I have left. As dawn approached, and the first hints of light began to creep over the horizon, Takeshi closed his eyes, offering a final prayer to the gods. He had already made up his mind. Tomorrow, the battle would decide not just the future of Japan, but the path of his soul. The first sounds of war came not with the clash of swords, but with the steady drumbeat of marching feet. The air was thick with the scent of sweat, earth, and the acrid smell of gunpowder as the Eastern Army and Western Army prepared for battle. Sekigahara, the stage for the decisive clash that would forever alter Japan's future, was alive with tension. But beneath that tension lay something far deeper, a feeling of inevitability. Takeshi stood with his comrades in the Western Army, the weight of his katana heavier than ever. The battlefield stretched out before him, filled with soldiers in shining armor, faces determined and set. His thoughts, usually focused on the battle ahead, were clouded with the memories of the decisions he had been grappling with. His loyalty to Mitsunari, his faith in the Toyotomi cause, had guided him up to this point. But now, as the battle began, a new reality seemed to creep in, creeping beneath his armor like a growing, inevitable force. The signal to advance was given with a resounding trumpet blast, and the clashing forces were upon each other in an instant. The ground shook beneath Takeshi's feet as the armies collided. Thousands of men, their armor glinting in the daylight, their swords raised high in anticipation. The Western Army, though passionate, seemed outmatched in numbers, and the Eastern Army, with its disciplined formation, surged forward like a wave against the shore. Takeshi's heart raced as he rushed into the fray, his katana swinging through the air with practiced precision. The noise was deafening, the clang of metal against metal, the shouts of warriors, the cries of pain that were drowned out by the surge of battle. His every movement was instinct, driven by his training, his body moving like a well-oiled machine. But amidst the chaos, Takeshi's mind struggled to remain clear. Every strike of his sword felt less like a defense of Mitsunari's cause and more like a desperate attempt to hold on to the only thing he had ever known: loyalty. He fought beside men whose faces he recognized, but even their resolve seemed weakened, as if the very earth beneath them had shifted. They weren't just fighting to win, they were fighting to survive. Ieyasu's forces were everywhere, overwhelming the Western Army with their superior numbers and tactics. The Eastern Army's musket fire rang out in waves, the smoke billowing around them, the air thick with the scent of gunpowder. Takeshi could see Ieyasu's banners in the distance, fluttering proudly in the wind. The Eastern Army's disciplined advance was like a force of nature, unyielding and relentless. Takeshi's comrades fought with fierce loyalty, but their resistance seemed almost futile against the might of Ieyasu's forces. Each strike, each desperate thrust of the sword, felt like it made less and less impact. He could see men falling all around him, friends, allies, strangers, all swept away by the tide of battle. The ground beneath him was slick with blood, the cries of the wounded filling the air, the weight of it all pressed down on him. As the fog of war blurred the line between right and wrong, as the battle raged on, Takeshi's internal struggle deepened. The fight was no longer about the physical conflict. It was about his soul, about his sense of honor, and the very loyalty that had defined him as a samurai. In the thick of battle, the reality of the situation became clearer than ever. Mitsunari's forces were losing. The Eastern Army was simply too strong, too well prepared, and with every passing moment, Ieyasu's forces gained ground. Takeshi stood in the heart of the chaos, his sword raised, his breath heavy. He looked around and saw the determination in his comrades' eyes, but also the fear, a fear that was impossible to mask. Mitsunari, despite his courage and passion, was not enough to turn the tide. Ieyasu's military genius had outmatched him in every way. Takeshi's heart was torn. His honor screamed for him to remain loyal to Mitsunari, to stand with his lord, despite the overwhelming odds. But as he saw more of his comrades fall, men he had trained with, fought with, his mind began to turn. Should I continue fighting for a cause that seems lost, even at the cost of everything I've ever known? The weight of his loyalty seemed to sink him further into despair. What if I left now? The thought crept into his mind like a whisper, a dangerous whisper, but one that couldn't be ignored. What if I sought out Ieyasu's camp and swore fealty to him? Would that be better than dying for a lost cause? He saw the images of the Toyotomi cause flashing in his mind. Hideyoshi's dream of a united Japan, of peace, of prosperity. But was that dream still possible? Or was it Ieyasu's vision that was the true path forward? As the battle continued to rage, Takeshi found himself standing amidst a pile of fallen warriors, their bodies lifeless beneath him. The Eastern Army had broken through their lines, and the Western Army was scattered. Takeshi's mind was clouded, and for a moment the fighting seemed to slow down as his own thoughts drowned out the chaos around him. A voice broke through the haze. It was Mitsunari, his voice booming, filled with desperation and unwavering conviction. Stand firm, stand strong for the Toyotomi, for the future of Japan. But Takeshi felt nothing but doubt. Was this fight worth the sacrifice? He looked to the battlefield, where the Eastern Army continued to overwhelm them. Ieyasu was no longer just a rival, he was the future of Japan, and Mitsunari's vision was fading. As the tide of the battle shifted, Takeshi's internal struggle reached a climax. Mitsunari's forces were faltering under the weight of the Eastern Army's advance, and the Western Army was beginning to break apart. Takeshi could hear the sound of Ieyasu's cavalry charging forward, the heavy footsteps like a drumbeat in his ears. His heart pounded in his chest as he faced the undeniable truth: Mitsunari's army was on the verge of defeat. This is it, Takeshi thought, his breath quickening. This is the moment that will define everything. The Western Army was crumbling, and Ieyasu's forces were closing in from all sides. Takeshi looked across the battlefield to where Mitsunari was rallying the remaining soldiers. His leader was giving his all, fighting with honor. But the reality was clear: the battle was lost. Takeshi's gaze shifted to the Eastern Army, their numbers growing by the minute. Ieyasu's banner was at the forefront, a symbol of strength and determination that seemed to tower over everything else. It was no longer just about loyalty to Mitsunari. It was about survival. And then, the most critical moment of his life arrived. Takeshi could see the chaos around him, the soldiers on both sides locked in a desperate struggle, their swords clashing in the deafening cacophony of battle. The turning point was obvious. Ieyasu's victory was inevitable, And with it came the painful realization that loyalty to Mitsunari might be unjustifiable in the face of this overwhelming force. Takeshi stood amidst the carnage, his sword raised high. For the first time, he felt his honor questioned by the reality before him. His loyalty to Mitsunari was no longer a simple truth, it was a liability, a path to destruction. And yet, every part of his being fought against the idea of betrayal. What if I surrender? The thought gripped him, as dangerous as the battlefield itself. What if I change sides and join Ieyasu, the man who has the future of Japan in his hands? The Western army faltered around him, their line breaking. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The time for loyalty to Mitsunari has passed. Takeshi, his sword raised to the sky, felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him. His future, and the future of Japan, was no longer certain. This was a moment of moral and spiritual reckoning. Would he remain loyal to the man he had sworn allegiance to, even as the world crumbled around him? Or would he survive and follow the rising tide of history, a new era under Ieyasu's rule? The dust had settled over Sekigahara, but the air was thick with the weight of loss. The battlefield, once teeming with the cries of soldiers and the clash of steel, was now silent. The Eastern Army, led by Ieyasu Tokugawa, had emerged victorious, its overwhelming forces crushing the Western Army under the weight of their discipline and sheer numbers. Takeshi stood among the survivors, his feet sinking into the blood-soaked earth, his katana at his side. He had survived the battle, but the victory was hollow, like the silence that followed the storm. His eyes swept across the remnants of the battlefield, the bodies of the fallen, the broken, and the damned. The Western Army, once proud and united under Ishida Mitsunari, had been shattered. The Toyotomi legacy, which Takeshi had sworn to protect with his very life, was now reduced to ashes. The cause that had defined his existence had crumbled, and the future of Japan lay in the hands of Ieyasu Tokugawa. Takeshi's heart felt like a stone in his chest, heavy and unyielding. He had fought for Mitsunari. He had fought for honor, for the Toyotomi clan, for the vision of a unified Japan under their banner. And now, with the dust settling on the battlefield, all that was left was a crushing defeat and the growing realization that everything he had fought for had been swept away. The sound of Ieyasu's army celebrating their victory reached Takeshi's ears, but he couldn't bring himself to join in. The Eastern Army, now triumphant, paraded their victory like a final thunderous statement. But for Takeshi, the sound of victory was the death knell for everything he had ever known. Ieyasu's forces had proven their superiority, not just in numbers but in strategy. The battle had been a turning point, and the Toyotomi clan's dreams were now crushed beneath the wheels of Tokugawa's relentless march. Takeshi couldn't shake the image of Mitsunari, his lord, standing tall among the men, rallying the Western Army with the same fire that had once inspired him. But now, as Ieyasu's banner waved proudly over the battlefield, Mitsunari's vision seemed lost in the wind. Loyalty to Mitsunari had been his guiding principle, but now it felt like a ghost, a relic of the past. His sword, once a symbol of honor, now felt like a burden, a weight that couldn't be lifted by victory, only by accepting the truth. As the days passed and the immediate aftermath of the battle gave way to the grim reality of defeat, Takeshi's soul grew heavier. He found himself wandering the wreckage of Sekigahara, haunted by the faces of the fallen, the Western Army, Those men he had fought beside had been decimated. Takeshi had lived for their cause, believing in the Toyotomi dream. But now, that dream was nothing more than a crushed hope beneath the iron heel of Tokugawa's victory. Did I make the right choice? Takeshi thought, his mind a whirlwind of doubt. Was my loyalty misplaced? He had sworn his sword to Mitsunari, but now, in the face of such overwhelming defeat, he couldn't help but wonder, was loyalty enough? Had he betrayed his own soul by staying loyal to a cause that was lost? His thoughts were interrupted by the sight of Mitsunari, his once proud leader, now captured and bound, being dragged before the Tokugawa forces. Takeshi stood frozen in place, watching the scene unfold before him. Mitsunari's once fiery spirit had been extinguished, replaced by a man who was broken and defeated. The soldiers of Ieyasu's army jeered, their voices filled with mockery and cruelty as they surrounded Mitsunari, their victory complete. Takeshi felt his heart tighten, the weight of his loyalty to Mitsunari suddenly suffocating him. He had once believed that dying for Mitsunari's cause would be an honorable end. But now, in the face of this humiliation, he wasn't sure if his loyalty had been worth the cost. The moment of regret was unbearable. What have I done? Takeshi thought, his hands trembling as he clutched the sword at his side. He had followed his lord to the very edge of destruction, but now, in the wake of the battle, he wasn't sure if his choices had been worth the sacrifice. The inevitable moment came swiftly. Mitsunari, the man who had fought with unwavering passion for the Toyotomi cause, was brought before a crowd. His once proud figure, now bloodied and broken, stood in stark contrast to the shining strength of Ieyasu's forces. The executioner raised his sword, and the crowd fell silent. Takeshi could feel his heart shatter as he watched the final moments of his lord unfold. He had sworn to serve Mitsunari until the end, but as the sword came down, the weight of his decision crushed him. Mitsunari's death marked the end of an era, a death that symbolized not just the fall of a man, but the fall of everything Takeshi had believed in. The echo of the sword's strike reverberated in Takeshi's mind. He felt sickened, not just by the act of violence, but by the realization that his loyalty had led to this moment. Is this what my loyalty was worth? He thought, the question hanging heavy in his chest. As the days following the battle turned into weeks, Takeshi found himself wandering the countryside, far from the battlefield that had once been his home. Ieyasu Tokugawa had triumphed, and now the country was beginning to shift under his rule. The Toyotomi cause had fallen, and Japan was uniting under Tokugawa's banner. The future, though uncertain, was becoming clearer with every passing day. Ieyasu would bring peace to a fragmented nation, but at what cost? Takeshi couldn't shake the feeling that he had been a part of something that had already fallen apart, a piece in a puzzle that no longer fit. He had spent his life fighting for honor, for loyalty. But now, as he looked to the future, he wondered if those ideals still had any meaning in a world where survival seemed to be the only thing that mattered. What now? Takeshi asked himself, his voice breaking the silence of the open fields. Is loyalty still worth it? His honor, his loyalty to Mitsunari, had been the foundation of his life. But now, as Ieyasu's empire began to take shape, he questioned whether survival was the only thing that mattered. Was it worth holding on to the past, to a legacy that had been lost in the wake of the battle? Or was it time to move forward, to accept that the future of Japan belonged to Ieyasu Tokugawa and let the past slip away like the fading light of dusk. Takeshi's footsteps echoed in the empty field, the weight of his thoughts heavier than the sword on his hip. The future was uncertain, and with Ieyasu's rise, Japan was changing, whether he liked it or not. Takeshi had lost everything, his lord, his cause, and perhaps his own soul. But one thing remained clear. Japan's future would be shaped by the forces of Tokugawa, and his place in it, whatever that future might be, was yet to be determined. With Mitsunari's death, Takeshi was left to pick up the pieces of a broken past and try to find a place in a new world that was no longer governed by the samurai code he had known. The days following the battle at Sekigahara were filled with silence, a silence that settled over Takeshi like a heavy shroud. Ieyasu Tokugawa's victory was a fact that no one could deny, but it was a victory that had come at the cost of something far greater than just lives. It had cost the very essence of honor, loyalty, and identity. The Western Army, shattered and broken, now lay in the wake of Tokugawa's triumph, and the Toyotomi legacy seemed all but erased from the history of Japan. Takeshi's world, once defined by his oath to his lord, his honor as a samurai, now seemed adrift, like a boat without a rudder. He sat alone at the edge of the camp, gazing at the setting sun as it cast long shadows over the fields of Sekigahara. The landscape, scarred by the battle, was still a silence now blanketing the land that had once been soaked in the roar of war. Takeshi had always found a strange comfort in the quiet after battle, a moment to reflect, to process the chaos and bloodshed that had just passed. But now, in the wake of the Toyotomi defeat, the stillness felt like an accusation. "What have I fought for?" Takeshi whispered to the evening air, his fingers wrapped tightly around the hilt of his katana, but the familiar weight no longer brought him the comfort it once had. The sword, a symbol of his loyalty to Mitsunari and the Toyotomi clan, now felt like a shackle, reminding him of the sacrifice he had made and the legacy that had crumbled to dust. The price of loyalty was something Takeshi had been raised to understand. His father, a proud samurai who had served Toyotomi Hideyoshi, had always taught him that honor was the foundation of a samurai's life. "Loyalty to one's lord is the highest virtue, Takeshi," his father had said, the words etched into Takeshi's heart. A samurai's life is not his own. It belongs to his lord. Only through loyalty can a samurai earn his place in this world. Imskrik. But now, as Takeshi reflected on the devastation around him, he couldn't escape the realization that blind loyalty to Mitsunari and the Toyotomi clan had come at the cost of so much more: his people's lives, his comrades' futures, and perhaps even his own sense of self. The price of loyalty had been more than he could bear. The Western Army's defeat had not just been a loss of soldiers, it had been the death of an ideal. The ideal that loyalty, no matter the cause, would ensure victory. The question that haunted him now was whether that loyalty had been worth it. Mitsunari had been a man of passion, a man who fought for the Toyotomi legacy, but he had failed to see that the world was changing. Ieyasu, with his overwhelming strength, had become the future of Japan, and the Western Army's resistance had been crushed beneath the weight of it. Loyalty to a cause that could no longer stand in the face of such power seemed misguided. Takeshi felt his father's voice echoing in his mind, but it felt distant now, as if it had come from a different time, a different world. Loyalty to a lord is everything, his father had said. But what happens when that lord cannot protect what he promised? Takeshi's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. He turned to find Ichiro, his oldest and most trusted comrade, standing before him. Ichiro's armor was battered, and his face was streaked with the grime of battle. But his eyes, those eyes that had always shared in Takeshi's struggles, were filled with a quiet resignation. "I see you're still here," Ichiro said, his voice low. "The men are starting to scatter. Some are leaving to swear allegiance to Ieyasu. They say the future of Japan is under Tokugawa's rule. What about you, Takeshi?" Takeshi didn't answer immediately. He simply stared at the ground, the weight of Ichiro's words sinking deep into his chest. "I don't know anymore, Ichiro," he replied quietly. "What's left to fight for? The Toyotomi cause is shattered, and Ieyasu will rule Japan. What do I owe to a lost cause?" Ichiro's eyes hardened, and he knelt beside Takeshi. "What do you mean, lost cause?" he asked, his voice sharp. "We fought for something, Takeshi. It wasn't for Mitsunari. It wasn't for Toyotomi Hideyoshi's dream. We fought for honor, for the future of our land. And that fight still means something, no matter what happens to Mitsunari." Takeshi shook his head, feeling a cold, bitter emptiness fill his chest. "Honor?" he murmured. "Honor feels empty now, Ichiro. I've watched too many good men die. I've seen our cause fall apart, and now we're left with nothing but the wreckage of a dream. What good is honor if it doesn't lead us to a future worth fighting for?" Ichiro gripped Takeshi's shoulder, his voice soft but firm. "You can't just throw away everything you've believed in. Honor isn't about winning, Takeshi. It's about standing for something. Even if we lose this fight, we can't let go of what we've stood for. Otherwise, everything we did, everything our fathers fought for, is meaningless." The conversation left Takeshi with more questions than answers. He had fought for the Toyotomi cause. But now, as Ieyasu's dominance loomed over the country, he wondered if peace was something that could only come through compromise, through bending loyalty to survive. Was it worth dying for a dream that was already dying itself? "Is loyalty still worth it?" he thought, standing up and looking out at the distant horizon. The rising sun, weak and distant, symbolized the new era of Japan. The war was over, but for Takeshi, the battle was just beginning, the battle for his soul. Could he stay loyal to Mitsunari and the Toyotomi legacy, knowing that his choices could bring further destruction? Or did he have to accept that Ieyasu's vision might be the only way forward? He had always believed that loyalty to his lord would bring him honor, but now the question was more complex. Was loyalty to Mitsunari worth the destruction of everything they had fought for? Was the Toyotomi legacy worth the blood and tears? Or was Ieyasu's rise the key to Japan's unity, no matter the price of their loyalty? Takeshi's heart was torn between the past and the future, between what he had fought for and what might be the only path forward for the people of Japan. The price of loyalty had become more than just a personal struggle. It was a question of whether loyalty had any place in a world that was rapidly changing, and whether the future he had once envisioned could ever be rebuilt. Personal reflection. That evening, as the moon rose high in the sky, Takeshi stood alone by the river that ran near the camp. The cold water flowed silently past him, carrying with it the memories of a time when loyalty, honor, and duty had defined everything. But now, As he looked into the reflection of the moon, he couldn't escape the growing emptiness within him. Is this the right choice? He thought, his heart heavy with uncertainty. How long can I keep fighting for something that is slipping away from me? Is peace worth the cost of betrayal? What does it mean to stand by a lost cause when all that is left is the honor we've been taught to uphold? He closed his eyes, the weight of the sword at his side a stark reminder of the oath he had taken, the choices he had made. I will remain loyal, he whispered to himself, though the words felt hollow. But at what cost? As the winds began to rise, carrying the scent of rain in the air, Takeshi made a vow to himself. He would stand firm in the honor of a samurai. But the path forward would no longer be about loyalty alone. It would be about survival, about finding peace in a country that was changing, and a future he could no longer ignore. The battle had barely ended, and already the echoes of victory were reverberating through the ranks of Ieyasu Tokugawa's army, his banners now flying high across the battlefield. But for Takeshi, the ringing of swords, the sound of steel meeting steel, had already faded into the background. The moment he had feared for so long had arrived. Mitsunari had been captured, and the Toyotomi legacy that Takeshi had fought to preserve was slipping away like sand through his fingers. The news of Mitsunari's capture spread quickly throughout the camp, carried on whispers, but Takeshi couldn't bring himself to believe it at first. Mitsunari had always been the one who had spoken of honor, of standing firm for the Toyotomi cause, of leading them all with an iron will. Now he was a prisoner, shackled and dragged before the Tokugawa forces. Takeshi's heart pounded in his chest as he followed the crowd to the place where Mitsunari was being held. His lord, once so powerful, now stood before him, a broken man, his face smeared with dirt, his eyes hollow, and his pride shattered. The once proud warrior now seemed a shadow of himself. My lord, Takeshi whispered under his breath, the weight of his loyalty sinking deep into his chest. What have we done? Mitsunari stood in the center, surrounded by Ieyasu soldiers, each one jeering, as if the man who had fought so fiercely was nothing more than a prisoner to be mocked. The Tokugawa forces had taken their time with Mitsunari's capture. No longer a man of strength, he was reduced to nothing. Takeshi could see it in the eyes of the soldiers. The victory had not just been in battle, it had been in the humiliation of his once great leader. Ieyasu's army, like a snake swallowing its prey, began to close in on the last remnants of the Toyotomi cause. Takeshi felt the crushing weight of history bearing down on him. He had followed Mitsunari for so long, his loyalty rooted in the belief that they were fighting for something greater. Now, all that remained was a man broken by defeat, a man who had failed to protect his vision for Japan. You are a disgrace, Mitsunari, one of Ieyasu's men sneered as they forced him to his knees. A servant to a lost cause, clinging to a dream that never was. Takeshi's heart twisted in agony as he watched the humiliation unfold. The Toyotomi legacy that had once been a beacon of hope, of unity, now lay in tatters. Mitsunari's sacrifice had been in vain, and Takeshi realized in that moment that no matter how fiercely they had fought, the Toyotomi vision had already been extinguished by the Tokugawa's might. As Mitsunari knelt before the Tokugawa soldiers, Takeshi felt the raw weight of his loyalty to his lord begin to crumble. The internal conflict that had been gnawing at him now felt like a physical ache, a deep wound that would not heal. What had he fought for? Was it worth it? Was it worth the lives lost, the families torn apart, and the honor that had now been so easily shattered? Takeshi's hands trembled as he watched his lord face the consequences of his failed vision. Mitsunari, once so full of life and fire, was now a broken man, and the Toyotomi cause that he had championed lay in ruins. "I swear I will fight until the end," Mitsunari had promised Takeshi. But now it was clear there would be no end for them. The rebellion was over. The dream of a unified Japan under the Toyotomi banner had been shattered. In the face of overwhelming power, loyalty seemed like a mere illusion. As Mitsunari's captors tied his hands, readying him for execution, Takeshi's heart filled with sorrow. "This is what it's come to," he thought bitterly. "All of it, my loyalty, my service, my sword, it has led to this." Mitsunari's head was held low, but his voice still carried the strength of a man who had lived for a cause, and he spoke out for all to hear. "I stand by my beliefs," Mitsunari said, his voice ringing out even as the Tokugawa soldiers approached with the executioner's blade. "No matter how this ends, my loyalty to the Toyotomi cause will never fade, and I die with the belief that Japan can be united under a cause greater than power." Takeshi watched, the words burning through him like fire. His loyalty to Mitsunari, to the Toyotomi cause, had been everything he had known. But now he realized how fragile that loyalty had been. Was it worth dying for something that could not stand against the tide of history? As the blade came down and Mitsunari's life was extinguished, Takeshi felt the weight of his own decisions crushing him. He could no longer deny it. The cause he had fought for was lost. The Toyotomi legacy had been extinguished, and Ieyasu's rise to power was inevitable. "Loyalty," Takeshi whispered under his breath, as his sword seemed to grow heavy in his hand. "What is it worth now? What is the price of loyalty when the cause has already crumbled?" In that moment, Takeshi saw the fragility of loyalty. His father's teachings, "Loyalty is the shield of the samurai," felt like they had been forged in a time that no longer existed. The battle was over, but the sword he had carried for so long now felt like a burden, and his honor felt like a relic of a dying world. Takeshi stood silently among the fallen, his heart heavy with the weight of the loss. The Toyotomi cause had failed, and Mitsunari's death was the final blow to a vision that had once seemed so certain. But as the blood of his lord soaked the earth beneath him, Takeshi's mind began to shift. The future was no longer just about loyalty to a lost cause. It was about survival, about navigating the new reality of a unified Japan under Ieyasu Tokugawa. "Is this my fate now?" Takeshi thought, feeling the cold wind of the coming era brushing against his skin. To follow a cause to its death, or to find a new path, a new future. His sword, his loyalty, his honor, they had all been tested, shattered. And now, in the wake of Mitsunari's execution, Takeshi realized that the true test of a samurai was not in his loyalty to a fallen lord, but in his ability to face the truth and move forward. As Takeshi stood in the silence that followed Mitsunari's death, the battlefield stretched out before him, empty and vast. The battle was over, and the future of Japan was now in the hands of Ieyasu Tokugawa. But the path forward was no longer about loyalty to a lord. It was about the courage to carve out a new future. "I don't know what comes next," Takeshi whispered to himself, "but I will not be bound by the past." With that, Takeshi turned away from the fallen Toyotomi cause and looked toward the new Japan that was beginning to take shape, one that was no longer built on blind loyalty, but on the strength to adapt, survive, and ultimately find a new purpose in a changing world. The days after the battle were filled with silence. Sekigahara was no longer a place of clashing armies and the deafening cries of soldiers. It had become a solemn memorial to the loss of the Toyotomi legacy and the shifting tides of Japan's future. Takeshi stood at the edge of the battlefield, the cold wind sweeping across the blood-soaked earth. Ieyasu Tokugawa's victory had reshaped the landscape of the country. But within Takeshi, the battle raged on, far from over. He had made his choice, and it was one that haunted him, the choice to abandon Mitsunari and his loyalty to the Toyotomi cause. In the quiet aftermath of the battle, Takeshi's heart was still in turmoil. His father's sword hung heavily at his side, a symbol of all he had once believed in the unwavering loyalty to one's lord and the honor of the samurai. But that honor had crumbled on the battlefield, shattered by the reality of war. Mitsunari, his lord, his friend, had died with the Toyotomi banner falling alongside him. And yet, even now, Takeshi could feel the weight of that decision, the shame of abandoning a cause, a man, and a legacy that had once defined him. He walked along the banks of a river, the sound of rushing water, a constant backdrop to the churning thoughts in his mind. He could still hear the echoes of Mitsunari's voice urging the samurai to fight for the Toyotomi vision, the ideal of a unified Japan under a single banner. But as the days passed, those ideals seemed more and more like a distant memory, a dream that had been overtaken by the harsh reality of Ieyasu's victory. Takeshi's steps were slow, weighed down by the burden of his choices. The battle was over, but the true fight was just beginning for him. He had sworn an oath, but the shifting tides of history had made that oath feel empty, like a broken promise. Yet, as he walked, a new realization began to dawn on him, a realization that had been creeping into his mind ever since he had left the battlefield. His role in Japan's future would no longer be about serving a single lord, no longer about fighting for the past. His role, he now understood, had to be about serving the people, about building a future where honor, loyalty, and principle could still mean something, even in a new world. One afternoon, as the sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, Takeshi made his way to the family grave. It was a place that had always been a source of comfort and guidance for him. His father's spirit was buried here, his honor immortalized in the simple stone that marked his resting place. Takeshi knelt before the grave, his heart heavy with the weight of the past and the choices he had made. He closed his eyes, and in the stillness, he could feel his father's presence. It wasn't just a memory, it was a legacy. The legacy of a man who had served Hideyoshi, who had fought for Japan, who had raised Takeshi to honor the way of the samurai. A samurai's life is not his own, his father's voice echoed in his mind. It is his lord's, and to his lord he owes everything. But now, sitting before his father's grave, Takeshi felt a shift within him. Was that still true? Could his life, his honor, be solely defined by the man he served? Was it possible to be a samurai without losing one's soul to the whims of a lord? As the wind whispered through the trees, Takeshi's thoughts deepened. His father had lived with unwavering loyalty, but the world had changed. The battle at Sekigahara had shown him that loyalty could no longer be a one-way street. Ieyasu Tokugawa was the future, and if Japan was ever to find peace, it could not be through blind loyalty to a single family. It had to be about principle. Takeshi placed his hand on the cold stone of the grave and whispered, "Father, I will carry your legacy, but I must find my own path. I will honor you, not just by serving a lord, but by serving the people of this land, by protecting what is right, no matter where that path leads me." And as he left the grave behind, Takeshi felt a weight lifted from his shoulders. The shadow of doubt that had clouded his thoughts now felt smaller, more manageable. The battle was lost. The Toyotomi cause had fallen. But the future of Japan was still unwritten. And in that unwritten future, Takeshi could carve out a place for himself. He returned to the Tokugawa camp, but not as a servant of Ieyasu, not as a man who swore blind allegiance. Instead, he would join Ieyasu's army as a man of principle, understanding the new world that was beginning to take shape. He would serve Japan not as a loyal samurai to a lord, but as a warrior of the people, a samurai who would fight not for the glory of one man, but for the future of his country. Takeshi found Ieyasu's quarters later that evening, the camp illuminated by the flickering lights of lanterns. He stood before Ieyasu's tent, the leader of the newly victorious Tokugawa forces, and felt the weight of his decision. This wasn't a decision he had come to lightly, and it wasn't one he could walk away from. He had sworn to serve, and now he would serve not because he was bound by a lord's will, but because he believed in the new order Ieyasu promised. A Japan united, a land of peace, a land where his honor could still flourish. The decision was not about forgetting the past, it was about embracing the future. Takeshi would no longer be defined by a lord's legacy, but by his own actions. His journey forward would not be easy, but he had come to understand that the path to redemption lay not in blind loyalty, but in the courage to change. "I will fight for peace, Ieyasu," Takeshi said, his voice steady and resolute. "I will fight for Japan." The sound of marching feet was almost hypnotic, the steady rhythm of thousands of soldiers moving in unison, each step forging the future of a unified Japan. Takeshi stood at the heart of Ieyasu Tokugawa's army, surrounded by the very forces he had once fought against. The Western army had been defeated, and now, in the aftermath of the Toyotomi collapse, he found himself standing shoulder to shoulder with the very soldiers who had once been his enemies. The Sengoku period was ending, and the Tokugawa shogunate was beginning to solidify its rule. The world had changed, and so had Takeshi. Takeshi had always believed that loyalty was the core of a samurai's identity. But Ieyasu's rise had forced him to confront the fragility of that loyalty, and now, as he served under a new lord, he could see the larger picture unfolding before him. Japan, for all its tumult and suffering, was slowly beginning to unite, and with that unity came the possibility of peace, a peace that Takeshi had once thought impossible. The first few months of service under Ieyasu were a whirlwind. Takeshi's role had shifted dramatically. The once fractured world of the samurai was now coming together, and with that, a new order was taking shape. He found himself working with men who had been on the opposing side of the battle, men who had once been his enemies. Yet, in the ranks of Ieyasu's army, there was a sense of purpose that had not existed during the chaos of the war. As the days passed, Takeshi realized that his loyalty to Ieyasu was not about blind fealty to one man. It was about serving Japan, about creating a future where his people, his family, could live in peace. Ieyasu's vision was a unified Japan, one that would end the constant fighting that had torn the country apart for centuries. For the first time, Takeshi began to see that his honor as a samurai did not lie in following a single lord, but in contributing to something greater, the creation of a stable, peaceful nation. As Takeshi continued to serve in Ieyasu's army, he found himself reflecting more and more on the cost of loyalty. The samurai had always been defined by their unwavering service to their lords, but now, as the era of the Sengoku came to an end, Takeshi realized that the very nature of loyalty was shifting. The chaos of the past had made loyalty to a lord the guiding principle of a samurai's life. Now, the loyalty he had pledged to Mitsunari and the Toyotomi clan seemed like a relic, a part of the past that was no longer relevant in the new world that was being built. Takeshi walked the battlegrounds of Sekigahara, now peaceful and still, but still haunted by the ghosts of the past. He thought of the brothers in arms he had lost, the men who had died for a cause that no longer existed. Mitsunari had fought for honor, for the preservation of the Toyotomi legacy, but now, after all the bloodshed, Takeshi couldn't help but wonder if it had all been in vain. "I fought for something that was lost," Takeshi whispered to himself, staring at the distant horizon, where the sun began to set, "and I left behind the only cause that had ever mattered to me." But as he stood there, surrounded by Ieyasu's soldiers, the reality of his survival began to take hold. The battle was over. The Tokugawa shogunate had won. And now, Takeshi had to find his place in the new world that was taking shape. The cost of his loyalty had been great, but the reward of survival, of peace, and of contributing to the creation of a unified Japan was not something he could ignore. "I fought for my lord," Takeshi thought, "but now I fight for the future of my people. I fight to build a new Japan, one where my children, my family, can live in peace. I may not be able to undo the past, but I can shape the future." Takeshi's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a fellow samurai calling his name. Taro, his old comrade, approached him, his face tired but determined. "Takeshi," Taro said, his voice heavy with the weight of their shared history, "I see it in your eyes. You're still torn, aren't you?" Takeshi turned to face him, his expression solemn. "How can I not be, Taro? I've spent my entire life serving Mitsunari, fighting for the Toyotomi cause. Now I'm serving a man who defeated everything we stood for." Taro placed a hand on Takeshi's shoulder, offering a grim smile. "You're not the only one, my friend. But you know, sometimes survival is the only thing that matters. We've lost so much, Takeshi. But Japan needs us. And Ieyasu's vision, it could bring peace, unity. That's something we've never had." Takeshi looked out at the horizon again, feeling the weight of Taro's words settle deep in his chest. The peace that Ieyasu promised was not just about ending the war. It was about creating a future where men like them could live without the shadow of battle and betrayal hanging over them. As the days passed, Takeshi wrestled with the consequences of his choices. He had abandoned Mitsunari, the man who had once been a brother in arms, a man who had fought for the same cause. But now, in the aftermath of the battle, he wondered if the cause they had fought for was worth the sacrifice. He watched as the Tokugawa forces began to impose their new order on Japan. Ieyasu's rule was sweeping across the land, unifying the country under one banner, and the samurai, those who had once fought for honor and loyalty, were now tasked with keeping the peace. It was a strange reality, one that felt both unfamiliar and necessary. Takeshi had always believed that a samurai's duty was to serve his lord. But now, in the face of a unified Japan, his duty seemed less clear. Was his loyalty to the Toyotomi cause worth more than the peace that Ieyasu promised? Was it more honorable to remain loyal to a fallen lord? Or was it more honorable to embrace the future and serve a new Japan? I have no answers, Takeshi thought, as he stared at the rising sun one morning. I've made my choice, but the path forward is still unclear. What is the price of survival? What is the cost of peace? His hand rested on the hilt of his katana. The blade had been with him through every battle, and now it would accompany him on the new journey ahead. He no longer fought for a single lord. He fought for the future, for peace, and for the people of Japan. I will find my way, Takeshi whispered to himself. Not as a servant to a lord, but as a man of principle. I will forge my own path, and I will carry my honor with me, for the future of Japan, and for the legacy of the samurai. The days had blurred together in the years following the great Battle of Sekigahara, but Takeshi could still feel the weight of the moment pressing upon him. The landscape of Japan had shifted, irreversibly, and with it, the very fabric of samurai life had changed. Ieyasu Tokugawa now stood at the helm of a unified Japan, his shogunate securing peace after centuries of relentless war. The Sengoku period, with its endless feuds, had come to an end, and a new era was being forged, one that, for better or worse, would leave the past behind. Takeshi stood atop a hill overlooking the land, the sun sinking low in the sky, painting the landscape with soft hues of gold and red. It had been a long journey, one filled with loyalty, betrayal, honor, and sacrifice, but now, standing in the shadow of the new world that had emerged, he was filled with an overwhelming sense of both peace and loss. Peace for the nation, but loss for the legacy of the samurai, the warriors who had fought for a world that no longer existed. The world of Mitsunari, of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, of unwavering loyalty to a single lord, was gone. The age of honor-bound warriors had faded into the past, and now Japan stood on the cusp of something else, a new era that demanded adaptability, compromise, and unity. Takeshi had spent years reflecting on the events that had led to Sekigahara, the battle, the decisions, the losses. He had been torn between duty to Mitsunari and the growing recognition that Ieyasu Tokugawa's power was a force he could not ignore. The reality of the situation was undeniable. Mitsunari's vision, though noble, had faltered under the weight of Ieyasu's strategy and might. Yet Mitsunari's death and the subsequent collapse of the Toyotomi clan had marked more than the end of a man's life. It had been the death of a dream, a vision of unity, and a way of life that could never return. But Takeshi had come to understand that loyalty alone could not guide a man's life. The concept that had once defined his samurai code, that a man's life was not his own, but belonged to his lord, was no longer enough. The battlefield of Sekigahara had forced him to confront that fact head-on. It was no longer about serving one man, one family, or one cause. It was about serving the greater good of Japan, about finding peace after centuries of war. In the wake of Mitsunari's death and the Tokugawa shogunate's rise, Takeshi realized that his duty as a samurai had shifted. His role now was not to serve Mitsunari or the Toyotomi cause, but to serve Japan itself, to protect the peace that had been bought with the blood of so many. The new order under Ieyasu required a different kind of loyalty, a loyalty to the nation and to the future of its people, rather than to the honor of a single lord. As the sunset painted the sky, Takeshi sat alone, reflecting on the choices he had made. He had sworn loyalty to Mitsunari, just as his father had sworn loyalty to Hideyoshi. His journey had been marked by moments of honor, defiance, and sacrifice. But now, as the final vestiges of the Sengoku period receded into the past, he understood that his place in this world was no longer defined by the loyalty to one man, one lord, or one cause. His place was to Japan itself, to the future of a country finally at peace. Takeshi thought of the Battle of Sekigahara, of the men he had fought alongside, and of those who had fallen in the dust of battle. Mitsunari had died for what he believed in, and so had the Toyotomi warriors. But the world had changed. Victory now belonged to Ieyasu, and the task before him and the people of Japan was not to fight for what had been lost, but to build for what had yet to come. The war was over. The future was beginning. As he sat in solitude, Takeshi allowed himself to look forward. The landscape of Japan now spread out before him. Ieyasu's vision was not perfect, but it was necessary. Peace had been forged not through endless war, but through compromise and stability. The price of survival had been great, but the cost of loyalty to a lost cause had been higher still. "I've lived my life for others," Takeshi whispered, his voice carried away by the wind. "Now, I will live for the future." Takeshi's journey had been long, and his purpose had changed along the way. The dreams of the Toyotomi were no more, but the legacy of the samurai could still survive not in loyalty to a single lord, but in the ability to adapt and serve the people. Takeshi knew that the lessons of the past, the lessons of honor, loyalty, and sacrifice, would live on in future generations. It would be their turn to carry the sword and fight for a world where peace was the ultimate goal. But it would also be their job to ensure that the samurai code evolved with the times to adapt the principles of the past to the realities of a new world. In the years to come, Takeshi would return to his family's grave, where his father's legacy still lay, and he would teach his own children the lessons he had learned. That honor was not just about serving one lord, but about serving the greater good. And that loyalty was not just a duty, but a choice that must be made in the face of a constantly changing world. And as Takeshi grew older, he would pass on the lessons of his life to the next generation of samurai, not as a warrior of blind loyalty, but as a man who had found his way through compromise, honor, and a deep sense of duty to the people and the land he had sworn to protect. The legacy of the samurai would continue, but it would not be the legacy of the past. It would be the legacy of the future, shaped by the lessons of the past, but forged in the fire of a new era. And Takeshi would stand as one of the men who had helped shape that new world, one where peace was the ultimate weapon, and honor was the courage to forge a new path. As the sun sets over the mountains of Japan, casting its golden glow on the land, that has seen so much bloodshed. We take a moment to reflect on the journey of one samurai, Takeshi, and the choices that defined not only his life, but the course of a nation's history. The Battle of Sekigahara was more than just a clash of armies. It was the culmination of centuries of conflict, a battle fought not only for territory, but for the soul of Japan itself. Takeshi's journey, from his unwavering loyalty to Mitsunari to his eventual decision to align himself with Ieyasu Tokugawa, offers us something profound. His internal struggle, a battle between honor and realpolitik, between his loyalty to the Toyotomi cause and the inevitable reality of Ieyasu's rise, is one that speaks to the heart of human experience. It speaks to all of us who have ever found ourselves torn between duty and the future. Takeshi's journey teaches us an invaluable lesson. Sometimes the path to peace requires more than loyalty to a single lord or a single cause. It requires the courage to choose the greater good, to look beyond the immediate cost of personal sacrifice, and consider the long-term consequences for all involved. True loyalty is not just about adhering to the will of one man, but about embracing the responsibility to shape a better future for everyone. So, as we reflect on Takeshi's choices, I want you to think about your own path. How often have you found yourself at a crossroads in life, stuck between the weight of loyalty and the desire to do what's best for the greater good? How often do we cling to what's comfortable, to what we know, even when the future demands change? Takeshi's struggle was not just about being loyal to Mitsunari or to Ieyasu. It was about his ability to adapt and embrace a new world. It's easy to get lost in the idea of honor, of maintaining loyalty no matter the cost. But sometimes the hardest thing to do is accept change, to let go of what we thought we knew and embrace something new. And in doing so, we shape the future with integrity and honor in our heart. Survival is not about winning. It's not about who claims victory on the battlefield or who wields the most power. Survival is about living with honor and integrity, even when the world around you is changing, even when the choices you make are difficult and fraught with uncertainty. Takeshi's story is a reminder that the true test of a samurai's character is not how many battles they win or how many enemies they defeat, but how they navigate the challenges of loyalty, duty, and the future. It's about the courage to stand firm in your principles, while also adapting to the greater good. As we close this chapter of Takeshi's life, I encourage you to think about your own journey. In the face of challenges, in the face of a world that is constantly evolving, will you remain steadfast to what you've always known? Or will you have the courage to make the difficult choices that will shape a better future for those around you? The world is never static, and sometimes survival is about much more than winning battles. If you enjoyed this journey through Takeshi's story, his choices, and the powerful lessons it teaches, don't forget to hit that like button and share this video with your friends. Let's spread the message of honor, loyalty, and change, and keep discussing the stories that shape us. Subscribe for more powerful historical journeys like this. And comment below, what would you have done if you were in Takeshi's shoes? Could you have chosen loyalty to a lost cause, or would you have embraced the future as Takeshi did? Let's talk about it. Until next time, fellow explorers, remember that the true legacy is not just in fighting for what we believe in, but in living with honor and courage, no matter the storm. Take care.